all the time you're doing that, there are people trying to kill you. It is unlikely that you'd have got this far, but if you did, unlucky. You might not have noticed this yet. If you're a woman, you won't have, because there was a shop on the right when we came in. Distracted. Behind you now, there is the inner defensive wall. This was built in the 1220s. 13 defensive towers and a 50-foot curtain. Soldiers on the ramparts and the fighting tops would now be hurling vicious verbal abuse at you. Not to mention stones, arrows, buckets of boiling waste, cow, sheep, salad, unwanted children, everything would be thrown at you. It's not a healthy place to stand. Up until the year 1275, you couldn't stand here because this was actually the River Thames. There's always been an entrance into the fortress from the river. Prior to 1275, it was just there. The lower left of the archway, there's a mooring loop for a boat. Now that's not been used in 700 years, but bizarrely gets painted every 10. When the outer wall was built, it was a tremendous feat of military engineering. The river had to be pushed back. This roadway was raised 20 feet to the height that we're on today, and this became the river entrance. This is the world infamous Traitor's Gate, but it's not its original name. Originally, it was known as the Watergate, for the obvious reason that boats and barges would come in here and offload stores and provisions. For that reason, it quickly became known as the Trader's Gate, like the tradesman's entrance. Yeah? Now, in the 16th century, there was something of a human traffic, and this was largely one way. Many of these people were prisoners, a lot of them accused of treason, and the watermen slid the name to Traitor's Gate. We've had some fairly famous traitors come through here. Queen Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife. Queen Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife. A disturbing pattern emerging here. Both of these traitors were brought into the tower and executed for treason. I shall show you where these two floozies were killed and where they lie later on. Mel Gibson. He should have been brought through these gates. A really hefty slap. Ever since the colossally inaccurate comedy Braveheart, there is barely a day goes by without some demented Scot, and I'm not saying all Scots are demented. Just the ones I meet. Demand to know, where did you keep William Wallace? He was my forefather. Check out my blue face and the family resemblance. And that's just the women. Get much more vocal. It is true that in the winter of 1299, Sir William Wallace did come through these gates, but you have already spent longer in the tower than this great man ever did. He was a knight of the Scottish court. As an insult to Scotland, the English classed him as a commoner. He was immediately taken from here to where they knew there'd be a big crowd, Smithfield Market. There, he was not beheaded. That was a noble execution. In front of that crowd, he was hanged by the neck until he was really rather uncomfortable. Only half-handed. They hauled him up, let him swing, let him down, took the noose from around his neck and revived him. When he came round, he saw a knife. Alarmingly, this was going into his chest. It was pulled down in a line, nipples to navel, so he was opened up. It wasn't a fatal wound and was never meant to be. Wallace was entirely conscious when his executioner's filthy hands plunged inside and disemboweled him. 36 feet of his intestines spilling out onto the pavement with a gush of blood which must have steamed in the cold winter air. These entrails were then placed on a hot griddle where they sizzled. And it's at this point that Mel Gibson would have you all believe a man can shout, "Freedom!" I just don't think that's likely. He must have had other things on his mind. His heart was being ripped out. Let's face it, that's a distraction. The heart was thrown into a brazier to burn, and that probably killed him. The head was taken off, and that was left on London Bridge. The body hacked into 4 pieces, and those quarters were then parboiled to preserve them for the long journey north to the border towns between England and Scotland, where those parts were left to rot on their gates as a warning to the barbaric and troublesome Scots, not to upset the clearly civilised, peace-loving and harmonious bloody English. So William Wallace, a truly great man of a truly great nation, was hand, drawn and murdered. You get nostalgic, don't you, really? I know I do. On a happier note, behind you we have the bloody tower. Again, this is not its original name. Originally it was known as the Garden Tower, but we changed it for marketing purposes. Now in 1483, the Garden Tower was so comfortable, it was actually the home of the King of England, Edward V, who you might not have heard of because he was just 12. His younger brother, Richard, the Duke of York, was only 10, and they were both here under the protection of their uncle Richard, the Duke of Gloucester. And they needed protection because there was a war on, the War of the Roses. Now this sounds like fun, but they weren't fighting with flowers. It was a bloody civil war which struggled on for nearly 30 years. These boys were targets. Gloucester knew that. He took his protection duties so seriously that he had Parliament declare his nephews to be bastards, so they could not keep the crown. He took it. He became King Richard III, and he was now the target. His nephews continued to play safely in the ground long after his coronation. That's all documented and fact, and it's also a fact that these boys disappeared from history. No one really knows when, why or how, but Shakespeare tells us that one night in 1483 they fell asleep up there and never woke up. During that night they were smothered to death with their own pillow. Stabbed with a dagger, for good measure. Now I'd like you children, especially you young children, to think about that at bedtime. Now, your mums and dads are going to tell you it's a long time ago, that's true. They're also going to tell you there are no more bad men. Kids, that's a lie. They're always bad men. Sometimes they're even under your bed. Or in your water. And that's when they'll get you, kids. Sweet dream. Just don't like children very much. Anyway, their disappearance was a mystery for nearly 200 years. In 1674, workmen on the south side of the White Tower removed a stone stairway and discovered a box. Inside this box were the dusty remains of 2 small people that experts at the time declared to be the bones of the princes. Charles II commanded they should be laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, in Innocents' Corner, which he'd named in their honour. Who killed them, we just don't know. Shakespeare would have us believe it was Uncle Richard. But let us not forget that Shakespeare was writing to amuse a redhead. And you never upset a redhead. Elizabeth I was a Tudor, and it was her grandfather, Henry Tudor, who defeated Richard at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, took the crown from Richard's dead head, and with no real claim to the throne, he declared himself king. And he could not have done this if these lads had been alive. At the time, no one knew they were dead. Maybe he did. It is entirely possible that Henry Tudor had those boys murdered. But Shakespeare couldn't write that. If he did, it would mean Elizabeth should not be the queen. One of the important lessons I learned from becoming a soldier into a historian is that history is not the past. It's actually not even a rough approximation of the past. History is the story of the past, written by the people who win. Remember that. This explains why French history books are very thin, with lots of large pictures. Now we do know that what Shakespeare referred to as the Tower of Blood, Elizabeth I chose to name the Bloody Tower. A marvel of medieval defensive architecture with a 2.5-ton oak and steel portcullis that is 700 years old and is in perfect working order. You can see how that works when you visit it later on. But this is the gateway to the inner ward, and we're going to charge through it. But charge is a military term. It means to move rapidly to engage in eager combat with an enemy. So let's not have the Italians at the front. Charge! Let's go. We are charging. Place your hand on the back of the man in front. This reassures them they are not alone. It also encourages them to move. Stop you stabbing them with your sword. Come on, let's go. Ah! It's always good not to be in the front of a charge. That is perfect.